Perhatian, which is, of course, Indonesian for Achtung, Achtung, I think.
Is it?
Yeah, well, it says that here. I don't know if I've pronounced it right. And
Sounded
in my customary haste, Jim, I didn't go to Google and get the actual, get a recording of someone so I could get it right. Anyway, 80 years ago, this very day, one of those remarkable small stories of the Second World War took place. A group of freed German prisoners proclaimed the Free Republic of Nias, an Indonesian island. Ernst Leo Fischer became the first Prime Minister. He appointed Albert Wering as the Foreign Minister. A month later, Japanese troops occupied the island, and the Republic was no more. Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and my recently repatriated co-host, James Holland, back from Italy. Jim?
Yeah, no, it was fantastic. I mean, that story. So the I can't remember what I've said about it, but the story. Well, it's called Endgame, but it's basically about the rivalry at the end of the war between Ernst Kaltenbrunner and Karl Wolff, who were the two most senior SS generals under Himmler. So Himmler's at the top, and then Wolff and Kaltenbrunner are sort of equal top billing. Yeah. And basically, they both absolutely hate each other's guts. And Wolff has been chief of staff to Himmler for most of the war, and is then head of all police forces and in Italy, and is basically kind of one of the kind of top two cheeses in Italy by the end of the war. Kaltenbrunner takes over from Heydrich as commander of the RSHA, the Reich Security Office. Yeah. So the SD, the Gestapo, all that kind of stuff, and the Kripo, after Heydrich gets killed in the summer of 1942. Yeah. And basically, they hate each other's guts with an absolute passion, and both of them are trying to put out peace feelers so that they can save their necks.
Yeah, that's the only reason they're interested in peace, isn't it? It's completely self-preservation.
I think so. I think with Wolff there is a kind of disenchantment, as a sort of realization that the Nazi state has failed. And he's not in that kind of sort of inner. It's not because he's doesn't believe in it anymore. It's more that he just thinks it's a busted flush.
Well, that's it. I mean, it's easy to be disillusioned in the Nazi state by the spring of 1945, isn't it?
Oh, yes,
it's no great leap of imagination required, is it? Or sudden ideological awakening, road to Damascus. No. Maybe Nazism ain't that cool. I mean, it's
no. That's very true. But the thing about it is, so both of them are trying to kind of sort of nuzzle in there with peace negotiations.
Yeah.
To save their necks, but each knows that the other is also doing that, so is trying to undermine that effort.
Yep.
And only one person can win, and it's and so anyway, so to cut a long story short, Wolff comes out on top,
right?
But there's all sorts of amazing twists and turns, and overall it involves the Prominenten, these 139 hostages that Kaltenbrunner has. It involves just money laundering on a gargantuan scale. Yeah. It involves art theft. It involves everyone lying. And it involves lots and lots of mountains, which was why I was in South Tyrol. And it is as a backdrop for making a documentary feature-length film, you can't really ask for more. So we were sort of hurtling over frozen lakes and all sorts of stuff.
That's the sort of gig where the cameraman basically starts to sort of purr.
Yeah.
Because they're thinking, if I put a nice lens on this will look absolutely insane on screen. I remember a long time ago working with when I did my German culture documentary about 10 years ago. We went in early February and it had snowed. And the director's going, oh no, everything's going to look the same. And the cameraman's, no, everything's going to look brilliant. I can, big blue sky, the snow, the German countryside. Don't worry, everything's going to look fantastic. So we had, you'll have had that, won't you? I mean,
I've got to say, I was purring too. I mean, I just, I was very, very happy being in the mountains. And you go to this extraordinary place called San Leonardo, which is kind of sort of north of Murano, at sort of end of a valley. There's a sort of mountain pass that sort of climbs out at the end of this valley. And in the old police station there in the cells was where where the Americans discovered Cranach's Adam and Eve, which, under Wolff's watch had been taken out of Uffizi for safekeeping. It's just the most extraordinary place. I mean, it really was stunningly beautiful. So that was all good.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, just strikes me you're talking about this. The sort of leeway for sheer villainy within the Nazi state. If you're a villain, I mean, it's like All your Christmases come at once, isn't it? It's the most extraordinary thing. If what you want to do is steal art from the Uffizi and stick it up in your living room, you can. It's
pretty much.
I mean, because obviously there's this idea that, it's, parsing apart the ideology and the idea that there's a sort of national quest and a sort of national mission in Nazism. That's obviously present, and that's a thing that they talk about a lot, and that's the thing that seems to motivate Hitler. But also, if what you want to do is nick stuff and clobber the people you don't like, it's an interesting contrast, isn't it? Or not contrast, or combination that because the sort of ideological end of itself regards itself as noble, doesn't it? As regard itself as a sort of higher cause and all that. But actually, if you're a gangster, fill your boots. It's sort of an extraordinary combo, isn't it? And because we don't talk about corruption in the Soviet state is totalitarian in its way, but we don't seem to talk about that kind of villainy and corruption. There are bad people, obviously, within the Soviet system. Like, Beria, for instance, is a good example of someone who's completely malevolently exploiting his position. But it doesn't sound like what he's doing. It's not in that sort of villainy bracket, is it?
Yeah, no, I know. And
do you know what I mean?
But weirdly, paradoxically, it's because they think they're on a higher plane that this is all sort of, they kind of justify it because, they're the master race and, it's, the Aryans should rule the world and therefore they should also be the custodians of great art and everything. I mean, the Italian art is slightly different in that, this is not being half-inched off, it's not being stolen off Jews to go in the Fuhrer Museum in Linz.
No, it's just...
This is taken out of Florence with the Italians understanding that it is going to be protected in case of bomb damage and all the rest of it. But at the end of the war, Himmler tells Wolf to send it to the salt mines at Altersee to join the rest of it. Yeah. And Wolf is thinking, no, I can't do this. This is part of my bargaining chip. I'm not going to send it to you. So he thinks, what am I going to do? I have to keep hold of this. So he's got it in this prison cell, stored in this prison cell in San Leonardo. He's also got it in some, it's called Campo something or other. Yeah. Some Schloss in the kind of high Tyrolean Alps, but on the Italian side of things. Although, obviously, that part of Italy has been morphed into the Reich for the duration of the war. Yeah. So it's no longer officially Italian territory. And he's thinking, no, I need to keep my hands on this. He just says, I'd love to send it to the salt mines of Altersee, Himmler, but I can't do that because I can't justify the use of fuel or trains. There's lots of bomb damage and stuff. That trust me, I'll get them there just as soon as I can. But just for the moment, at least they're safe and we can use them. And one day they'll line the walls of the Fuhrer Museum. And Himmler goes, oh, all right then, fine. and and that's the end of the matter. But consequently, they are in this. They are in this prison cell and everything. I mean, it is just amazing. And the Prominenten is just extraordinary, this kind of sort of almost shootout between the Wehrmacht and the SS troops, which is signed off, incidentally, in favour of the Wehrmacht by Wolf.
Right.
Because the SS troops are Kaltenbrunner's SS troops, not his SS troops. Yeah. So it's extraordinary. And you have this extraordinary situation that in the Hotel Bachmann in Niederdorf, because they're supposed to be going to this hotel resort on the edge of this high Tyrolean lake called the Pragsee See. Yeah. But when they get there, they found that the Luftwaffe have just moved in. You might ask yourself quite reasonably, what Luftwaffe by late April 1945? But anyway, they're in there. So they're holed up in these various hotels in this sort of mountain tourist village called Niederdorf, where there is this. And you've got this situation that in the Hotel Bachmann, General Falkenhayn, General George Thomas, non-friend of the show, and Sigismund Payne Best, who was one of the two agents captured at the Venlo incident by the Gestapo
right at the start
in November 1939, are all roomies.
Oh, incredible!
They're sharing a room together. I mean, how weird is that? So the whole thing, I mean, literally you couldn't make it up. And then you've got you've got Friedrich Schwendt, who is Kaltenbrunner's man at the Schloss Labers just outside Murano in the South Tyrol, doing all his money laundering racket. I mean, it's just so bizarre. I mean, you literally couldn't make it up. You don't need to make it up because the drama and ridiculousness of the whole thing is so. But also, it just undermines, which is what you're sort of alluding to, is the total absurdity of the Third Reich. You know, had it not been so kind of awfully malicious and terrible for the world. You know, it sort of it's part of what I've always said, which is that they're living in La La Land. Yeah. It's a total fantasy world which they're sort of making up all along and all the time, and it's just completely bonkers. But anyway, but I got back on Friday, and I've been reading your book, which I've got to say I think it's just really, really outstandingly good.
Oh, thanks, James.
It's really good. It's proper grown up history book with properly researched, properly thought through, and you're saying really, really interesting and new things. And I think when it comes to Second World War, it's incredibly rare to find, I think you know, popular narrative fiction, popular kind of commercial non-fiction, where people are saying something new. And you absolutely do. You've really got me thinking about all sorts of things about
thanks,
Bradley
Jim.
and Patton and Monty and stuff, and all the stuff about Monty and the VD is really brilliant, really, really brilliant.
Well, you know, funnily enough, because we talked about that on the live cast, which if you're a Patreon member, you know about, but if you don't, we do a live cast every other Monday where James and I sort of talk in this manner and take questions. And last Monday we were going to talk to Peter Caddick-Adams, and he couldn't come on, so we ended up basically having to
talking about VD.
But I spoke to the Colonel watched last week, and he told me about what it was like being the duty officer in the 50s. As a national serviceman, and what you would do is there were brothels that were that you turned, because basically what we talked about last week was the fact that VD in the First World War was a massive problem for the British Army, and in the end it became like a moral panic, British society problem, with all sorts of things into the mix. But basically I think the numbers are amazing, because the First World War is synonymous with trench foot. That's the thing they teach you about at when you do, I don't know, Key Stage 4 history, First World War, and they take you to Flanders with your school trip. It's trench foot is the terrible thing about the First World War. 74,000 men hospitalised with trench foot in the First World War. The First World War is synonymous with trench foot, but more than 400,000 men hospitalised with venereal disease during the First War. Anyway, it's just amazing. So it's the elephant in the room when the army get going again in France in 1939. The BEF go back to France in 1939. For all the people who were officers, particularly staff officers like Montgomery, who was not only a subaltern but then a staff officer in the First World War, VD is really forward.
It's very much on your forefront.
It's very much
your planning.
But the Colonel was saying, so what happens? What used to happen in the 50s?
Well, particularly when you're static. That's the point.
Well, and you got nothing to do, and everyone's bored shitless, and it's an absolute direct to morale.
You're sitting there digging trenches and stuff, and fanning around, freezing your nuts off.
Well, and
so you think, okay, weekend, I'll go to Lille.
And you can't train properly because you haven't got the kit, because the kit hasn't arrived yet, because the procurement isn't lined up. The army's massively expanded, is absorbing all those territorial battalions. So it's new people coming to soldiering. It's got listlessness if their officers aren't up to scratch. Because the army hasn't shaken itself through at this point. But yes. So it's the Colonel was saying what you used to do in the 50s is, and obviously this is all national service product of having conscripts, is that there were brothels you could go to. You would sign a book saying that's where you were going, and when you got back, you had to wash yourself with, I don't know, iodine or something, and
carbolic.
Carbolic. And if you were going, you were issued with condoms. And Dad said, to some sort of young public school subaltern coming into the system, this was all rather hair-raising when your men would come back and go, they'd boast about what they'd got up to and all this sort of stuff. It's all a bit of a shock. So all those things, I think that's what's really interesting, is all those things in the mix, all those sorts of, because after all, in the First World War, you've got people who don't want the army to issue. The army never issued condoms in the First World War, even though that's obviously the sensible thing to do, because there's such panic around it. And you've got the sort of moralistic people who say, well, if you issue condoms, they're only going to have sex. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, that's why we want to issue them. And the other end of people going, if you don't, it's going to cause VD. It's just the sort of mix of it all. And the thing is, this is, an army with conscription as a social experiment, I think, is a very interesting subject. That suddenly, the ruling classes are faced with the actual morals and habits of the people they rule, rather than their idealized rules and habits. And that's what you get in the First World War, and that's what you get in the Second World War. And I think, again, that's another reason the war is so interesting, is because you have the, cheek by jowl, the ruling classes and the middle classes, the bourgeois, having to deal with the working classes and vice versa in a way that otherwise normally they wouldn't have to.
Yeah. Well, and that comes through also very, very strongly with your last chapter, which I thought was just stunning, the one on Peter White. But I should just explain. So the book is called Command, and what you've done is you've taken a commander from differing ranks and different backgrounds and talked about them and their backgrounds and their motivations, but also kind of tended to kind of sort of focus on certain aspects of that. It's not like each one, the Bradley chapter is a potted history, a biography of Bradley. It's much more cleverly done than that. And you're saying different and interesting points on each, but also going off on sort of rabbit holes, rabbit holes, and in
the style of this podcast,
in the style of this podcast. But I was really, really struck by the Peter White one. So Peter White is the author of With the Jocks about the 52nd Lowland Division. Who come kind of sort of quite late to the party in terms of frontline troops. Yeah. And it's really made, and I thought it was just really, really fantastically written. It was really thought provoking, really good, and you could really tell that you were really moved by his experience.
Yeah.
And it made me sort of stop and think about the lot of the infantrymen and just how bad it was, and how you're sort of the infantryman in the Second World War is the person that we're most familiar with because of jumping out of landing craft, because of Omar Beach, because of sort of Commando comics and all the rest of it, and movies. But actually, the infantryman is the sort of bottom of the pile, and I was reflecting about it, and I was thinking, with the exception of the Japanese, I reckon the kind of rates of attrition within an infantry battalion were more or less the same wherever you were. Yeah. With Japanese accepted, where basically everyone died. Yeah. You've got, how many, the difference with the Eastern Front is you've got so many more infantry divisions than you have, say, for the British Army. Yeah. But in a battalion, your rate of attrition for 6 months of fighting is probably 100%.
You see, this is the thing I think that's...
In excess of 100%.
But I think this is the thing that's really interesting, Jim, because you said that at the start there that, the rifleman is the person we're most familiar with, or sort of, he's our ideal of that's what pops into your head when you think of a soldier in the Second World War, with his SMLE and his puttees and his khaki drab and his medieval helmet. And I think we don't know about him at all. We really do not know about the infantryman's experience at all. And I think, because the thing I keep coming back to, and again, a little bit watching some of the stuff of the war in Ukraine, is first of all, you're living in the open all the time. You are living in at best, if you're in, if you're at the front, you're living in a hole you've dug that's full of rainwater. That that maybe if you're fortunate and things are quiet, you don't have to go to the toilet in that hole. You're eating food that's probably cold because lighting a burner will give off smoke and give away your position. And one of the things Peter White goes on and on about in the book is that whenever they inherit positions from another battalion, if the other lot have been good in their field discipline and made sure they don't light their burners and don't light fires in the trenches, then the Germans don't know where they are. And so you inherit a position that's inherently safer. Whereas if the other lot have been slack, you inherit somewhere that's been keyed into mortar ranging and you're going to get shelled and shot at. And just so the business of living, before you fix bayonets, before you put one up the spout, before you go over a start line, the business of living in the open all the time is absolutely, plainly totally exhausting, demeaning, and potentially the thing that would break your morale long before anyone shot at you.
Well, I was struck with this by talking to the Monty's Men guys at We Have Waste Fest last September, because for anyone who doesn't know, Monty's men are very, very, very serious about their living history.
Yeah.
So you can only get in if you're good, you're properly trained, you're thin, and all those sort of things. I mean, you have to be the right age, you have to be the right look.
Yeah.
There's sort of, I don't know whether there's kind of sort of public examinations exactly, but it's kind of not far off it.
Yeah.
So, and they don't really perform in public. What they mainly do is they do it for themselves out of interest, and they go in a field, and they basically don't go fighting Germans, but what they do is they live like them and learn the drills absolutely to the letter and do exercises. So basically, it's like a Second World War training operation. Yeah. So imagine yourself a training company. That's what they're like.
Yeah.
And at the end of a weekend, they're all absolutely knackered, and these are kind of sort of 25-year-old blokes.
Yeah.
Because they've been living in a hole. They've been living out in the open. They've been living off Second World War rations. They've been doing it exactly, what they can't do in the Second World War.
Well, I mean, after all,
that's 2 days.
If you're trying to keep yourself warm, if your body is trying to keep itself warm because you're living out in the cold, you're tearing through calories in a way that you don't if you live in a nice double glazed, centrally heated house like I do. So, and yet the food is, the food is arguably fine, and certainly ration scales in Allied armies are much, much better than they are in the enemy armies and all that. We have to remember that and bear that in mind when talking about this and drawing these comparisons. But basically, what it does to your body to produce the heat needed means that whatever food you get is incredibly important, and obviously never touches the sides. So you're in this already before we have the fear of moaning minis and MG42s or whatever. You're in that physical loop that is predicated on exhaustion, aren't you? I mean, which is the thing I find for a start. You really need to think about and get your head around. And obviously, we've talked about armored soldiers a lot on the podcast, and I do think they have it that tiny bit easier because they're at least they can, if they want, they can sleep in the tank out of the rain and out of the cold, although obviously tanks get very, very hot and they get very, very cold, and they're disagreeable environments too. But they're not sleeping in ditches and
they've got a cover over their head.
Yeah, exactly. And when you look at that winter campaign that Peter White fights, because he does all you're right. They're late 52nd Lowland are late to the party, and they've had this incredibly checkered career. So they're 52nd Lowland are part of the abortive attempt to land men at Cherbourg and re-influence things in 1940, and they're withdrawn out through Cherbourg again. They go in, they're there for sort of 4 or 5 days, and they bugger off. Then that's about it, and then they're repurposed as mountain troops, and the idea is that for Norway or whatever, and then they're actually part of Fortitude North. And their deployment and their training is fed into the deception campaign. The idea that the British are going to go to Norway. So they're this very peculiar outfit who are sort of at one point their value is as a deception rather than as a serious part of a reserve, which must be incredibly dispiriting. Those sort of troops who are in a reserve and who are going to be used as some sort of fire brigade. Also, they have terrible problems with discipline and all that sort of thing because the men are bored. The men are bored. They aren't in theatre. They aren't in campaign. They haven't got stuff to do. So there's all that going on with them. And then of course, they're the airborne. They're the air landing reserve for Market Garden. And that doesn't happen. And at one point, they do get their orders to learn how to do manifests on gliders. And then are stood down, which is amazing that there's this sudden flurry in their battle diaries of like, oh Christ, we've got to figure out how to load a hauser. I mean, how do we do that? And then they go in Walcheren in the Walcheren offensive
in October. So they start the war long after those. So it's short days, long nights. It's bad weather from the off. And obviously. One of the trials in Normandy is the fact that the days are really, really long. So you get up early, you go to bed late. A dawn attack will be going in at 4:30 in the morning or whatever, and you've wound down at midnight. There's all that going on, but at least the weather isn't sort of as afflictive as it is for the men fighting that winter. And those stories,
I've talked about sleeping in the open, fighting in the open in January, late January, early February in Holland and on the German border,
where the ground's frozen. So
it's just
mortars are just 5 times as bad as they would normally.
Exactly, and you're completely up against the weather. You're shivering. Hard to dig in. You're shivering the whole time. So again, that sort of calorific expenditure that's going on. I mean, I think we don't know about the infantryman. We think we do. We think we've got a picture of him, but I don't think we've. More and more I think about it, the more I think we've no idea what that was like and how oppressive it was.
But you have to think. It's. Again, I think people are just so sort of seduced by numbers, aren't they? Statistics and all these things need context. That's the issue.
Yeah. We just need to take a very, very quick break. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. James and I are talking infantry.
Think about it not in terms of bullets and mortars. Think of it in terms of conditions. And think about, I sort of think about how I had a kind of, postponed 3 times 50th birthday weekend this weekend in the Isle of Wight. And, I only got 5 hours sleep and I was hanging a bit yesterday morning.
Yeah.
And I spent the whole day just feeling completely dreadful.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, that's sort of lack of sleep and alcohol, obviously. But just, times that by 10.
Yeah.
In terms of sleep, 10 days worth of kind of not enough sleep before you have any chance, and sometimes quite often longer than that.
Yeah.
So that constantly feeling fatigued, constantly feeling just a bit hungry, freezing your nuts off, as you say, and then just how you handle the fear and the danger and the kind of brutality of it.
Yeah.
And people might be thinking, oh, no, compared to kind of Eastern Front, it was nothing like as bad. Or, the Japanese army on those islands, like Peleliu, where 64 walk out of alive at the end after 14,000 are dead or whatever. I think the Japanese are, and the Chinese are kind of possibly the only exceptions. But I think everyone else, I mean, you think about the US 4th Infantry Division, which lands with 45 casualties or whatever, 45 deaths on D-Day.
Yeah.
But has lost 100% of its fighting effectiveness in 2 weeks of the Cotentin Peninsula.
Yeah.
You think about the 85th US 85th Division in the Apennines, which after 2 weeks has lost 9,500 men to casualties. Yeah. Which is, in a 16,000 strong infantry division, is basically its fighting. Fighting element. That's gone just in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And I remember that of all the people that I interviewed for my book about Italy all those years ago, I think out of maybe 35 frontline soldiers that I interviewed, one had not been wounded.
God. But the thing is...
He was the only one who got through unscathed.
But then...
And obviously witnessed gargantuan amounts of destruction and death and mayhem.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that Peter White does talk about, and sort of, and I think is another thing that doesn't get talked about very often in this arena, is fear. And I think
absolutely. I mean, I'd just be absolutely shitting myself.
Well, because the Americans did they surveyed their troops a lot, and there's a thing from the Pacific where they did with this instance of fear symptoms reported by US soldiers, right? Because the thing is you're absolutely right. On the East, we think of the Eastern Front as the numbers being bigger, so the fatalities being worse, blah blah blah. But the fear, wherever it was occurring in the world, the experience of fear, your experience
is pretty constant.
I would imagine is constant. That being shelled, being shot at, being machine gunned, being mortared. Surely the fear is the universal, right? In all this, so the Americans. In Division A South Pacific, they surveyed 2,095 men. Violent pounding of the heart, 84%. Sinking feeling in the stomach, 69%. Shaking or trembling all over, 61%. And this is fear symptoms people are prepared to admit to, right? Cold sweat, 56%. Feeling weak or faint, 49%. Feeling stiff, 45%, vomiting 27%, losing control of bowels 21%, urinating in pants 10%. This is the thing. Again, we don't really talk about very much. And obviously the British developed a sort of, rather not talk about it, old chap, stiff upper lip way of facing.
We want to make a fuss.
Exactly. But and obviously you can't make windows into men's souls and all that. But this is the thing that these people were experiencing on a daily basis, this kind of fear, and what that must do to you, especially as you're exhausted as well. And
yes, I mean, a lot of people have talked to me about the tank, the bank of courage, and that everyone's bank, a bit like your body metabolism. Everyone's metabolism is different, and everyone's bank of courage is different, but it's still there. And there's a point where it kind of runs out. John Semkin said that after Geilenkirchen, he was washed out. He just couldn't do any more. His tank had run dry, and you can replenish that tank to a certain extent, but you'll never get it. It's like a sort of a rechargeable battery. It'll never go back to kind of how it was when it first came out of the packet. And I remember talking to this wonderful guy who was in the 3rd Coldstream Battalion. He was a local sort of, farmer's son and country boy. He lived near where I live. And he'd been in the 3rd Coldstreams. And I remember him talking about it was north of Florence. No, south of Florence. It was in the Chianti Hills. It was north of Trasimeno. And they were moving forward. And he said how it worked was that, companies and platoons would take it in turns to lead off on an attack. And it was this young 19-year-old platoon sergeant's turn. And he'd noticed that he was struggling in the days leading up to, beforehand, that he was extra snappy and difficult and, argumentative and het up. And anyway, the night before the attack, it was one of those sort of dawn attacks that they do early in the morning. This guy was in a complete state. And my guy said to him, look, just go to the back of the line, go and see the MO and get out of it. And he was like, no, I can't do that. I can't let the men know that there's anything wrong with me. I'm fine. Just stop going on about it and all the rest of it. Anyway, they did this big attack, came under fire, got completely pinned down. And everyone was looking at the platoon sergeant to do something. And he was absolutely shot, so he just stood up and charged and got mowed down and was killed.
Right.
And my friend said to me, he said the problem was his fear, although he'd shot his bolt, his fear of letting down his mates and letting down the sergeant, of humiliating himself, was actually greater than the fear of death. But both fears were very, very real.
I mean, there's this really interesting quote from John Ellis's Sharp End has a really good chapter on this, and he quotes this guy called Jack Belden, who says, I am afraid, to a greater or lesser degree, in every battle. I cannot exactly say that I have overcome my fear, but rather that my fear has not yet overcome me. Which I think that's a fascinating way of looking at it.
Isn't it?
Never yet overcome me. I cannot recall any moment on the battlefield where I was completely panic-stricken and lost my presence of mind. I've had flashes of sheer terror when I heard and saw a bomb hurtling toward me, and I had 1 second of paralysing fear when I was wounded, but I've never lost the capacity for thinking and coming to a decision. But he's thought about it, and I think this is to go back to Peter White. What's so interesting with him is he doesn't varnish any aspect of being an infantryman in that last bit of the Second World War.
No,
and we've talked about this a lot. The sort of, the broad brush newspaper account of the Second World War in the West is D-Day, Arnhem, victory in May 1945. Right? There's maybe the Battle of the Bulge if you're lucky, but like an Anglo-centric point of view, that's what you get. But if you're fighting in those veritable battles, those battles in the depths of winter, where because I've been looking at. I've got one more chapter to write, and I've been looking at armored warfare theory and all that sort of stuff, and the Swanning.
You're doing Hobart.
I'm doing Percy Hobart, who I think. What I think about him and 79th Armoured Division is that that's actually the greatest the greatest tank theoretician and commander of the Second World War is Percy Hobart, even though he never commands actually in the classical sense. The Guderian has got nothing on Percy Hobart, because Percy Hobart invents the perfect armoured assault force, infantry support armoured assault force of the Second World War, which never fights as a division, which is because it's so brilliantly integrated. That's not what it does. And that if integration is the key to successful use of armour, then what you have is an armoured division that doesn't fight as a division, that's sent to where it needs to go. And that the Churchill Crocodile, is the ultimate infantry tank. It's the perfect infantry support weapon. There's nothing...
It's the most ferocious armoured fighting vehicle of the war.
Absolutely,
bar none.
Absolutely.
Bar none.
And if the job
try talking to a German veteran about and then talk to a British veteran about a Tiger. Well, and compare the reactions.
But if the job of the armour is to integrate and protect the infantry, then what is the Crocodile is the perfect expression of that, and you get that in White's account of the fighting in the winter of early 1945. Because
funny enough, you do in the American accounts of Geilenkirchen and the infantryman's attack. They talk less about the Sherwood Rangers than they do about the crocodiles that were accompanying them at Geilenkirchen.
Because after all, the tank. If you look at where the tank comes from in the First World War, its job is it's an assault weapon, and the idea is it pops open the enemy and supports the infantry, and that's what it's for. And that sort of the glorious sort of swans of May 1940, when the Germans break out and swan about, and there's sort of nothing for them to fight. Is that really armour's role? No, that's the fruits of successful armoured warfare, rather than its actual job.
Well, and of course, the moments of breakthrough for the Germans are an all arms operation. Exactly.
So this is what I'm writing about. Why I'm writing about Hobart, but the thing is because Veritable and Blackcock and all those battles are essentially assault battles where you've German lines that you've got to break open, and then you move on to the next German line you've got to break open. It's sort of like high-speed First World War combat. Just no one's got time to dig in quite in the way they had in the First World War. You've not quite reached that. The chance for it to get static never quite arrives, and White is going through that. They go to start. With the Jocks is a story of start line after start line after start line. Company taking. The O group is always about who goes first. Every single O group he goes to, is his boss Smig going, "I'm sorry, Peter, your chap's going to have to go first," or "Don't worry, Peter, it's not your turn this time." And that is it, and that's the life of the platoon commander. Because I think when I started writing this book, obviously I wanted to write about Montgomery, but not when he's Monty, when he's sort of nascent. And his talent that the army hasn't quite brought itself to recognise yet. Quite. I mean, obviously he's had some lucky escapes because he's got good patrons. But I also wanted to write about what it's like being, keeping a platoon going and going to those.
And it comes across incredibly well. And you do this heartbreaking story. That they're going forward. They know the Germans are in this wood. They know they're somewhere. They don't know quite where they are. And then at some point there's a ridge, which as you point out on a normal day in peacetime would just be a lovely balmy walk in the lovely woods, but suddenly become a death zone because the moment you go on a ridge you're silhouetted against it, and someone has
to go over it first,
and someone has to take that leap of faith, and someone has to do it, and the first guy gets shot in the head, second one gets hit in the stomach, and stomach wounds tended to be fatal, generally speaking, but not always, but usually, and he then gets over, and the guy with what's he called, Byers, I think, or something like that. He's wounded, and they need to go. Everything within him is saying, "Go and rescue Byers."
Yeah,
and he feels extra bad because he had to put him on a charge the night before.
That's
for some minor,
for some lip.
Yeah, but he also knows that if he goes and rescues him, he'll get killed or wounded himself, and that's actually then going to bring down the small unit cohesion even more.
Yeah,
and he just can't, and so he doesn't. And what happens, of course, is what the British tend to do is as soon as they hit any kind of serious opposition, they go, okay, don't worry about this one. We're not going to lose lots of men now.
Yeah.
Pull back at night. We'll come in with the heavy artillery. Now we know where the enemy are. We'll zero in on them with the mortars and tanks and artillery, and then we'll move through the next day.
Yeah.
And they can't get to Byers.
Yeah.
And so they come across him the next day, and there he is, and he's died. And it's clear that he's not died immediately because he's thrown up.
Yeah.
Because, and he's basically just sort of, his old internal sides have just gone to mush, and the life force has drained away from him. And it's very clear that for White, this is a moment that he returns to time and time again. Could he have done something different? Is there anything he could have done to save that guy's life? And the truth is clearly not. But this guy has this awful, terrible, lonely death where he's on this wood, throwing up, life force stripping away, and you would know that. And it's one thing being blown to smithereens and you don't know anything about it. It's another thing having to reconcile the fact that you are dying and that is your fate in this lonely corner of a wood.
Yeah.
And so many people faced this in the Second World War.
Yeah.
And it's just it's the infantryman's lot is a human tragedy, and there is sort of terrible classism going on, because if you're smart and bright, you end up in the Air Force or the Navy or a different or the engineers or the artillery or whatever. Yeah. And so there is this sort of class discrimination,
completely.
Which whilst by the same time it is also being equalised, because you've got guys from lower strata becoming officers.
Well, yes. So the army undergoes this massive reform. Sort of. I mean, it's the same.
And we're talking about the British, but I think this is across the board.
Oh, it's across the board. Yeah.
It's not just the British. We're talking about your chapter and Peter White, but read this for what we're saying for a kind of across the board. It's the same with the Americans. It's the same with the Germans. As German structure changes, you're not middle class university boys by the end of the Second World War. Yeah. You're guys who've proved yourself as an NCO beforehand and bumped up through the ranks.
Yes, I mean it's the
same with the Soviet
egalitarian opportunity to be killed as a subaltern being offered, in the officer class. It's it's broadened out. Everyone can have the opportunity of being killed,
randomly and brutally,
and live with the horrendous responsibility of running a platoon or higher. I mean, the interesting thing about that, it's our listener Andy Aitchison who told me to read With the Jocks. So I completely have to thank him for this, having written about this.
Well, I did drop him a note about your chapter, actually.
Oh, great! Oh, thanks.
Excellent. He was very, very pumped, I have to say.
Oh, great. But this sort of obviously the infantry end up with these people, but arguably being an infantryman is the one where you need the smartest people, because the job is changing permanently. It's changing with every single piece of terrain, and you need people who can read, because fighting in a village is different to fighting in a field, is different to fighting in a wood, is different to fighting in a town, is different different to fighting that's somewhere that's flooded. The sheer amount of stuff that you need to be able to do to be a good infantry officer. You've got to be able to work with the armour. You've got to be able to work with your artillery. You've got to be able to work with your mortars, your support weapons. That actually, and that counts not just for the officers, it's the NCOs, and in fact the riflemen have all got to be savvy to all these things all at once. And yet, you're at the bottom of the food chain in terms of who you're being given, and you're treated as at the bottom of the food chain. I mean, it's all...
And also in terms of it's socially and regionally a complete mesh up as well.
Yeah.
I mean, because you've got the irony with the 52nd Lowland Division, the Lowland Division trained for mountain warfare, who then go into the lowlands.
Yeah.
And actually, most of them aren't from the lowlands anyway.
Yeah. Well, there's lots of. They're mostly.
Peter White's from Surrey, isn't he? In South Africa?
Well, he's from Surrey. The NCOs tend to be Cockneys, and the soldiers tend to be Scottish. And the books sort of got that dated. He goes, the wonderful way the Cockney can work with the Glaswegian is a truly heartening thing to watch.
Cockney, yeah.
Exactly, a wonderful chap with Cockney. But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that the infantryman, after all, and we, when we talked about Barbarossa the week before last, you look at the distances that the Lancer are trying to cover on foot, in the summer of 1941, where they're doing 45 kilometres a day marches, and they'll put in a march at, that kind of distance, and then have to fight. They'll march up to somewhere, 45k up to somewhere, and then have to assault it, and then the fighting will stop, and then they'll be told, right, okay, next place, and they'll march another 40 kilometres the next day. The sheer physical exertion of it beggars belief, really.
Well, but ultimately, for all the privations, for all the humiliations, for all the difficulties, and all the rest of it, it is still the rate of attrition, which I think is just so completely brutal. Yeah. And I can't stress this enough that if you're an infantry battalion of you're 900 men, pretty much all of whom are going to be frontline troops, apart from you just can't help but be. Yeah. Unlike other units, it's not like an armoured regiment where 45% of you are actually, or 48% of you are actually driving trucks and probably not putting yourself in that much danger. In an infantry battalion, pretty much everyone is in the front line, even the clerks at battalion headquarters, because you're never far behind the front line. No. There are plenty of battalion commanders who buy it. Yeah. And statistically, you do not have a chance of coming through unscathed. No. So you will know in very quick order that your chances of getting through, and whether you are blown to smithereens, whether you have a stomach wound and are left for dead your life force sups away from you for over several hours, or whether you get a nick, or whether you lose a leg, or whether you have something a little bit more debilitating, like an eye or a bullet through the jaw or whatever, and survive, is really just a matter of chance. Yeah. And you would know that, and it's just, it's just hats off, isn't it? I mean, it's just incredible. Yeah. I really think there's a case for doing I'm supposed to be I'm doing Casino obviously now, and then I'm supposed to be doing Westwall, which is the kind of the winter battles. Yeah. I think there's a case for doing an infantry battalion. Yeah. A bit like the Sherwood Rangers one, but following an infantry battalion. I just think it'd be so interesting. And grim, but so interesting.
But if you picked a DLI battalion, they go everywhere, they do everything, and the people you start the book with will probably not be at the end of it, will they? Is the thing? Yeah. Is the sheer churn of it. And as ever, like you say, the people who aren't injured are the outliers. Yep. Anyway, I think that's probably all. That's.
I think there's a bit more to be said on infantry, so I think we should maybe come back to that next week.
That's a good idea. I think we should.
And think about another aspect of it.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, that's all the war waffle we have in us for today. Join us on Thursday for a fascinating chat with Christopher Moran about Ian Fleming's Second World War, which
that was good.
Really, really good. And our sort of cousin podcast, The Rest Is History.
They rather dissed him, didn't they?
They rather dissed him, and I think if you heard Mr. Sandbrook's outrageous slurs on Ian Fleming, this is the perfect antidote on Thursday. We will see you soon. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.
Cheerio.